Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my series on what I did on my FDL. Thank you for coming, both everybody who's in person and those of you online. It's nice to see you here. We can go to the PowerPoint. So for my FDL, or Faculty Development Leave, it's part of a program here at Tarrant County College District, which is in the Texas, Fort Worth area, and we are at the Southeast Campus. And this program allows a faculty member to come up with a wild idea and pursue it if they want to do that. And we have to write a proposal, and so I did so. And it goes through a series of signatures and a committee. And if you come up with a good enough plan, they okay it, and they okayed my plan. My plan was to study some of the pioneers of the biological sciences. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was the subject of episode 1 for natural selection. Gregor Mendel, known as the father of genetics. That's the main topic of today's episode. And Andreas Vesalius, known as the father of anatomy, and he'll be one of the focuses of episode 3. And I wanted to find out about their lives. My proposal involved looking at visiting where they were born, where they grew up, where they went to college, where they worked, visit their final resting place. I couldn't do that for all of them. For instance, Vesalius has died on some Greek island. They don't even know where it is. But I tried to do as much as I could, and I wanted to get inside their heads and try and find out, why do we remember these folks today? Vesalius came up with the best anatomy textbook back in the 1500s, 500 years ago. Mendel and Darwin worked in the mid-1800s, 150 years ago. So why is it that we're still talking about them today? And in order to do this, I had to go over there. And I spent 2 months in Europe. I spent just under 2 weeks in England doing various things for episode 1. Then I went to northern Italy, where Vesalius did most of his work at the University of Padua, over here just near Venice. And I also went and studied some other folks here, Camillo Golgi in just south of Milan. Went to Florence and worked up a bit about Galileo. I'll include those in episode 3. Then I went to Paris and met my oldest daughter, Shelby, who's working on a graduate degree in Holocaust history, who really leaned on me and said, hey, can I go with you? And I made her write a proposal and asked her to write just like mine. Tell me where you want to go, why you want to go there, what do you want to get from there? And she did an actually fantastic job. So I met her in Paris, and we went to Munich and Nuremberg, Prague, Warsaw, and Krakow. That was a really somber experience, actually. Museums and 4 concentration camps within 2 weeks. And that's going to be what we went and saw, learned, and felt is going to be the topic of episode 4. And she left Krakow and came home, and I got on a bus and went to a city in southern Chechnya, the Czech Republic, called Brno, which is where my base of operations for studying Mendel was. And after that, I got done. I went to Vienna, where he went to college and did some things in Vienna. And I had a little extra time on my hands after that I was done with my work, and so I got on a bus, train, and I went to Salzburg and Innsbruck and Zurich and Geneva and Amsterdam. It was terrible. So Gregor Johann Mendel, his birth name, his christened name was Johann. That's what he went by for most of his life until he became a monk, and they gave him the name Gregor, which is what he went by after that. And you see, he was born, he was just a little younger than Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809, and so Mendel lived until 1884. This is a pretty typical picture of him. He's very serious and somber in his pictures, but he wasn't like that in real life. He was a real friendly and jovial fella. Also, this must have been while he was young, because he was described as being a rather large fella who didn't pass up on many meals, and who said that his existence was miserable in a place where universal gravitation prevailed. Something I can understand. These are 2 of the references that I used, amongst others. The classic biography of Mendel, written by Hugo Iltis, and his name will come up a little bit later. It's a really good, really dense, informative book, kind of dry. And this other one by Robin Hennig is a little bit different. It's more of a lighthearted look at Mendel's life, although it is pretty serious. But one of the things I liked about this book is that each chapter has a quote of some kind or another, some of it related to gardening, a lot of them. And I thought to myself, I'm going to do that in my presentation. So as you see, as I transition from one topic to another, there will be a quote, most of them from that book, but maybe perhaps one that I added in. So I took the bus from Krakow, a 5-hour bus ride, which sounds like not fun, but actually it was. I spent a lot of time on trains and buses, and most of the time I was looking out the window. And some of my family is here, and we've all traveled a lot together. They know how much I'm a window seat person. And so it was fascinating riding on a train through southern Bavaria and watching going through the forests of southern Poland and the Czech Republic. It was actually really beautiful. One of the things that really surprised me is that it looked like the hill country of Texas. There were deer stands everywhere. I didn't really expect that. While my daughter and I were going on a train through southern Germany, I said, "This is where Little Red Riding Hood lives." And so you know who else lives there with her. So the next slide involves Krakow, Prague, this area as a close-up. And back in the 1800s, this area of the world was ruled by the Habsburg Empire, and they were German. They spoke German, and one of the things that they really like to do is keep their thumb on the local populations. And so, for instance, in the Czech Republic, they weren't allowed to use the Czech language in commerce or education. They feared for their kingdom, and there was different fiefs. So this area here, I couldn't get the circles to cooperate. This area here is Bavaria, and then this area here is what's called Moravia, and I'm sorry, Bohemia. This is Bohemia. This is Moravia here. There's Brno, the Czech word for that. And this outline here, this is a place that involves a little bit of southern Poland, southwestern Poland, and the northern Czech Republic called Silesia. And Mendel grew up in a town right about here, just outside the border. And so he spoke German, but he spoke it with a Silesian accent. And much like a lot of the accents, not as much anymore, but you could always tell somebody is from the south, right, y'all? Or maybe Baston. And so that followed him around for a while. And then Vienna is going to play into the story down here in Austria, which was the capital of the Habsburg Empire at the time. So here's Brno, and I was going to get into, I rented a car to go to his little place where he grew up here, a little hamlet, beautiful little hamlet called Heisendorf back in the day. Today in Czech, it's called Hinčesy. It's about 75 miles. And if you look at the names on that map, I understood them as well as you did, as well as you do here. Driving was a challenge, and I just got behind somebody. I didn't know how fast I was going. I didn't know really where I was going, except that I figured out where my exit was going to be. That was quite the challenge. And I managed to get back in one piece. Had a nice little rent car. Got that for $50 for a day. And finally, this is my exit. This is not the town. This is the nearest small city, and that's what I was looking at, trying to navigate. Hinčesy is that's how you pronounce this. And that's not. There's some sort of symbol that goes over this C that I wasn't able to get. That's the Czech name. The Germans called it Heisendorf. And this is an aerial view of the place where he grew up. And what I really wanted to show you from this picture is, look at these words down here. That's my life for 2 weeks in Poland and the Czech Republic. I left there after 2 weeks. I couldn't even say, "Where's the bathroom?" or "Thank you." It's just, talk about a foreign language. And it turned out I was 45 days in non-English speaking countries. And that was an interesting experience and challenge. It wasn't this big when Mendel was a little child. His father was a peasant farmer working for the local baron, And every once in a while, they would come by and they would tell everybody, okay, usually about 2, 3 days a week, where they would have to do public works like build roads and stuff like that. Eventually, Mendel's father made enough money to buy the land and expand the family home. And so as we go into Mendel's house, there we go. If I can read it, what happened to my thing here? Here's one of the quotes. A garden is like the self. So many layers and winding paths, real or imagined. It can never be known completely, even by the most intimate of friends. A quote from Deep in the Green by Anne Raver. And I think that says a lot about Mendel. He didn't really know himself. His family didn't really know him. He was terribly anxious, suffered from anxiety, and had really bad test anxiety. It was real severe in his life. His family, his father named Anton was described as a small, thin, swarthy, hairy, gloomy fella, and his mother Rosine the exact opposite, sweet-natured, broad-shouldered and browed, stout like a farm woman would be, and easy to bring to laughter. The complete opposite of the father. Gregor was the middle child. His oldest sister Veronica was a lot older than him, resembled his father more in temperament. And by the time Mendel became about 10 years old, Veronica had been married and moved off. Mendel was very close with his littlest sister, his younger sister, Teresa. They became fast friends for their whole entire life. And she stepped in at one point to help him with his education. Today we kind of take our K through 12 kind of for granted. But back then, if you wanted to go to school, you had to pay for it. And his family was very poor. And they were running out of money. And at one point, Teresa said, you can take part of my inheritance, my dowry. And she used that to send him to school. And he forever was grateful for that. And later on sent his nephews to school in Brno. And it was a nice, peaceful little building. There's a museum there. It's a museum. And they have a nice little walking tour where you scan a QR code and it'll tell you a little bit about that part of the house. This is the entranceway that I just showed over here. The rest of the courtyard, a nice little well, really peaceful, small town. I could just stay there for a long time. And they redid the house like it was. It's not the original furniture, but it's set up the way that an 1850s home would look like. Pretty typical bedroom, typical dining area. And they rent it out these days. You can rent it out for conventions, meetings, weddings. And they've turned the barn into this sort of like little convention center. And in the first episode, I talked about some of the theories of inheritance before Darwin's natural selection. One of them being the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea that the giraffe got a longer neck so it could reach the leaves in the trees because it wanted to. Of course, that doesn't hold anymore, but they were trying. And I thought it was interesting to see a giraffe there in the museum. They even have a pea, a big giant pea pod. And I brought with me today some pea plants. They're very young. They're only about 3 weeks old. There's a couple of them. They'll eventually go into my garden. And although it was very awkward to try and write this, my handwriting's not good anyway, but there was a little sign-in sheet. And so there I signed in to announce my presence for all of posterity, professor of biology, Tarrant County College, Southeast, as thanks and recognition for sending me there. And a statue. You know how I am about statues. I don't have a whole lot of pictures of me with the Mendel statues, though. And so one of the things that happened is that he ran out of money for education. His instructors at what they call gymnasium, which is what we would call high school, say about 10th grade, recognized that he had promise and that he needed to continue his education, but there was no money. And so his instructor was friends with the abbot of the monastery at St. Thomas in Brno. And so he said, hey, how about going into the clergy? And this is a quote from Charles Darwin's uncle, who sent a letter to Darwin's father to convince him to allow him to go on the voyage of the Beagle. And so this quote, and I know you can read, but I'll read these kind of things here. You know, there's not a lot of words on my slides. The pursuit of natural history, though certainly not professional, is very suitable to a clergyman. So that was in about 1830. Later on, one of the members of the Royal Society of Scientists in London coined the term scientist and said we should recognize people that study natural history as scientists, and that was about 1840, and that's where the term came and professionalized the role of a scientist. So he goes to Brno, where he meets Cyril Knapp, abbot. Now, an abbot is somewhere in rank between a priest and a bishop, and so it's actually a kind of a rare rank. And they were of the order of the Augustinian monastery from St. Augustine, who promoted studying natural history and promoted studying science. And St. Augustine once said that when you pray, you're talking to God. When you read, God is talking to you. And so the monks at St. Thomas Abbey were encouraged to study the sciences, which is why Mendel's professor sent him there. And that always plays into the role of luck in somebody's life. And you know, we try, you work hard, you do the right things, but every once in a while you just get lucky. And I think having Abbot Knapp come into Mendel's life was kind of a bit of luck. And another thing about working in the sciences is you need a patron. You need somebody to support you. In academia, you either have to write a grant to pay your way, or that might be to a government agency, or it might be to a private industry. And so in this instance, with Mendel becoming a monk, he didn't really have to worry about money. Although he did work, he taught a lot. He was a substitute teacher. He worked a lot in the classroom, but he didn't have to worry about bills. He didn't have to worry about the electric bill, which just came today. It wasn't so bad this time. And one of the things that as I was working up Darwin, I was working up Mendel and the others, I realized that the process of these people studying and becoming scientists has some similarities with my journey to become a scientist. Now, I'm not saying I'm Mendel, and I'm not saying I'm Darwin, but the journey is similar. And I have my own patrons. So look at this idiot over here. That's in the late 1970s. I'm probably about 17 there, with my dear sweet mother, who's in the audience with us. This is my father when he was very young. I have no idea. He was a teenager or 20 years old when that picture was taken. And this, of course, is my dear sweet mother. That's one of my favorite pictures of her. And on the right there is my stepfather, Albert Fadden, otherwise known as Packy. This was him when he was a soldier in World War II. He was the face. They put his face on the recruiting pictures and put his face out there to try and glamorize being a soldier. No, not really. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers in France. Just happened to be a handsome fella. Later on in life, this is him trying out to be a secret agent for the British ministry. He did eventually become one, and his number was 0029. That's a little family secret. But as far as patrons are concerned, here's a bunch of Domino's guys. I'm not in that picture. When I was 24 years old, I was working as a manager at Domino's Pizza in Chicago, and it just really didn't really want to do that for the rest of my life. But I had, like Darwin, my first attempt at college didn't work out so well, much to my own issues. And back then, there wasn't really the kind of financial aid structure we have today. Just like with Mendel, if you wanted to go to school, somebody had to pay for it. So at this point, my mom and my stepfather are living in New Jersey, and he got out of the Army and became a union iron worker, and he could have very easily had said, well, that's just the way Craig's life has worked out. He's done it to himself. He's an adult. He's 24 years old. He's got a job. And that would have been perfectly legitimate. But that's not what he said. He said, the kid sounds smart. Bring him here and let's send him to school. So between these three people are my patrons. Sorry. And they sent me to school. And as my dad said, we sent him to school and he never left. Here I am. So I wouldn't be here talking about this if it wasn't for those three and the efforts that they brought. So Mendel goes to Brno, and he becomes a monk, a novice as it was. This is the monastery as it looked in the late 1800s. We can see his greenhouse is right here. And as I walked in my very first time, I was in awe. Here is the monastery and the cathedral associated with it. Now, this is the picture of the garden that is commonly in biology textbooks. That Mendel grew peas, and he grew a lot of stuff. He grew food for the monastery. And I showed this picture in my general biology classes for, I don't even want to say how long, probably at this point close to 35 years. And I took that picture. And to just be standing there looking at that was just like, wow. And it turns out that although this was probably part of the garden, and at least the food garden, it wasn't big enough for Mendel's experiments. And it also turns out that that's his bedroom right here. We'll take a look at what he saw when he looked out of his bedroom in just a second. And of course, the selfie. Me in Mendel's garden, sporting my team colors. Thank you, Dr. Vu. Thank you, Emily. I didn't take very many things with me over there because I was going from place to place to place. I had very little luggage. This thing turned out to be absolute gold. And of course, when I went to go do a tour of the abbey, they asked me if I was a professor, if I could get an educational discount. And I said, I didn't bring the ID though. And they said, well, it says that on your jacket. I was like, okay, so it got me a half price. So here's the view of the abbey, what it looked like, how it looked back in the time. The greenhouse that Abbot Knapp built specifically for Darwin to conduct his experiments, and it burned down in the late 1800s, and they've rebuilt it about 20 years ago. I'll show you some pictures of that. The people of Brno don't like the new greenhouse. It's a sort of modern. There's a statue of him just off to the left that you'll see. The garden that I showed you just a picture of is, off to the right. There's a statue over there off to the right. This is a brewery, and they describe oftentimes when the wind was right, the smell of yeast would blow into the courtyard. These are the steps that go up to where Mendel had an apiary where he bred and raised bees and some other interesting stuff up there. And these are the stairways that he didn't go up there later in life. These are the ones where he said that universal gravitation was a limitation. Here's the new greenhouse, built in the sort of the modern version. Like I said, the residents don't really like it that much. It was pretty interesting, though. This is the place to rent out for a convention, a meeting, or a wedding in Brno. Brno, the experience there was kind of interesting. The author of that second book, she also visited Brno on her whatever that word is, pilgrimage, and she described it as a somber, gloomy city whose air of Soviet occupation can still be felt. And I most certainly felt that way. All of Eastern Europe was a lot different. You'd be on the bus or a train. The children wouldn't be smiling and running around and goofing off. You would look at somebody. You wouldn't really look them in the eye. If they did, they were uncomfortable. If you smiled at them, they wondered what you were up to. So that was kind of interesting. So while I was there, it turns out that it was the current abbot's birthday, and they were getting ready to have a birthday party for him that evening, and they were roasting a pig on a rotisserie over there. It smelled really good the whole time. There's the caterers over there. Not that I'm obsessed with food, but I am. A pretty nice courtyard. So Mendel wanted to be a teacher. And so they sent him to the University of Vienna to take an examination for his teaching certificate. And at the time, there was a written exam, and then there was an oral exam. And like the quote here says, and this is so true, Bradley appreciate this, a garden is always a series of losses set against a few triumphs, like life itself. At 70, which I'm getting close to, by May Sarton. So we went there, and he went to take his oral exam. And here's another similarity. When I was a PhD student, in order to go from being PhD student to PhD candidate, you had to pass your oral exams. I went to graduate school at UTA, and there was a couple of possibilities. Thumbs up, yes, you pass. They could say, well, thumbs up, kind of, but you have some deficiencies that you need to overcome, and that's really actually the most common outcome. They grilled me for 3 hours, and they usually can find a weakness. They say, all right, you need to take this class, or you need to study this, and we'll retest you over that topic. They can say you failed, but we'll allow you to retest. And that's not terribly uncommon either. And they can also, in graduate school, tell you, you failed, go away, leave me alone. Don't ever come back here. So it's really stressful. And this was just like what my exam was like, although I had a bigger whiteboard. There were 6 professors, a table with some water on it, and me. And like I said, they grilled me for 3 hours. And my dad told me, he said, look, if they ask you a question you can answer, just go with it. You can talk like nobody I've ever known. And I did until they told me, all right, next question. So I go out in the hallway while they're deliberating, and they've got me out there for like 45 minutes. And I'm like, oh, what in the world is going on? And they finally came out and they said, you pass unconditional. I find out later on that they had all arrived at that within the first minute after I walked out of the room, and they were talking about a party they were having that weekend. And they were just letting me sweat out there. Because picture a cat playing with a ball of yarn. They're the cat, you're the yarn. This is their idea of fun. Mendel's test was an epic failure, just like my attempt at ice skating last weekend. No, that's not me. Those are figure skates. I'm a hockey player. But it was terrible. He had written an essay on meteorology, and he became the Bruins official meteorologist later on in life, that they found acceptable but not remarkable. They didn't really like his answers on the written test, and then he failed miserably when they asked him to classify mammals and give some uses of mammals to humans. And back in the 1800s, when they looked at the diversity of the world, everything had to have a purpose, a reason to exist to satisfy humans. So that's the genesis of that question. Of course, in my view today, everything gets to just live because it's here and the world is a beautiful place. But back then it was a little bit different. And the classification, they dinged Mendel because in his classification of the mammals, he never used one official name of a taxon, which is one of these categories. The taxonomy system, taxonomy is the study of classifying and organizing animals, life, and was developed by Carl Linnaeus. That's not really his name. He was a Swedish guy. He was Carl Linné, but he Latinized his name. He was thrilled with Latin, and we can thank him for all the Latin names in biology today. But it's now become the standard. If you're working on an organism, you could work on a group of, say, they asked Mendel to classify the mammals. That's the name, Mammalia. Linnaeus had two kingdoms, Plantae and Animalia. And we classify those according to cell structure. This is the classification for humans. I'll go over that real quickly. The next category down is the phylum. Humans belong to the phylum Chordata. You can think of the chordates all having backbones, although that's a little bit of an oversimplification. And there's other ways of becoming a chordate. You could be a fish, a frog, a bird. Mammals have hair and feed their young with milk. And there's a couple ways of being a mammal. The placental mammal, like most of us, marsupial with the pockets. And there's lots of ways of being a mammal. You could be a bear, you could be a zebra, you could be a unicorn. Wait, we don't have unicorns. We belong to the order Primates, and one of the categories of Primates is that we have one of these, the opposable thumb. Some of them have the opposable toe, so they can cling from trees. We belong to the family Hominidae, which means humans, and the genus Homo means man, as in mankind, And we belong to the species Homo sapiens, which is the wise man, which I question sometimes. And it went on like that forever until about 1990, when DNA technology started becoming a little bit more apparent. One fellow was had decided that the kingdom wasn't the highest level, actually, that we had grouped the single-celled simple creatures called prokaryotes into bacteria, and it turns out that it's much more complicated than that. So it developed a level of organization above kingdom, which, just like, if you think about that, after 300 years of the classification system, then all of a sudden a new one above kingdom, it's just like, that didn't really take on from 1990. I don't think it really made it into the biology textbooks until the 2000s. But that just goes to show you that science builds upon itself. Sometimes we hear, if it's for me, tell them I'm busy. Sometimes I tell that to my students too. A phrase went around several years: trust the science. Never question the science. There can't be a less scientific statement than never question the science. That's what science does. Science questions itself and builds upon itself. And here's a pretty good example where that happened at a pretty high level. Anyway, so he failed, but he failed with a condition. They decided that he had promise, and that his problem was that above the level of the gymnasium, basically 10th or 11th grade, that he was mostly self-taught and didn't have formal education. So he went back to the monastery, and Abbot Knapp said, okay, well, we're going to send you to the University of Vienna, as it's called today, and we're going to be able to get you some formal education so that you can, quote, fit yourself. And so that's what he did. And so they sent Mendel back to Vienna, and so, of course, went to Vienna too. Oh, that was a little warm. And Vienna is a beautiful city. This is the place called the Votive Church. I was there during the daytime. It was a beautiful day. People just scattered out on the lawn enjoying the day. And when I went by there that night, I couldn't believe how pretty the church was lit up. This would have been the church when Mendel was coming from Brno to Vienna on the train. He would one of the first things he would have seen when he got to the northern train station. So he goes back to the college there, which eventually is going to be the Gregor Mendel Institute, Gregor Mendel Institute of Molecular Plant Biology, as it's known today. There's not much there. There's nothing there except the name of the department, actually, from when Mendel went to school. But he had some influential professors, like probably all of us did, and probably all of us aspire to be in other people's lives. I know that when I think back about my time at college and graduate school, obviously you learned a lot of stuff. You read a lot of textbooks. You took a lot of tests. You learned a lot of material in different classes and everything. But one of the things is that I remember most is the people that I learned it from. My major professor for my PhD degree was is a tremendous influence on me. And in a lot of ways, I've sort of become him. One of the things that launched me on a career in science, was my favorite class, and I should have put a picture of him up here, in high school, was AP biology, taught by a guy named Professor Amend, we called Prof A. So in deference to him, I have my students call me Dr. B. Well, I'm not the only Dr. B in the room today. And so he had a big influence on not just me, but everybody else that went to that high school. And so Mendel came across one of these names will be familiar. Franz Unger was a plant pathologist, and he taught Mendel techniques in hybridizing plants, which was a new and upcoming science back then. And Mendel became a very, very proficient hybridizer. He was very close to Unger. Another thing that Unger taught him was to do experiments and have large sample sizes, which was absolutely unheard of in the 1850s. Quantitative analysis didn't really become mainstream in biology until the early 1900s, to explain genetic patterns. Another professor he had was Christian Doppler. You might recognize that name from the Doppler weather radar. The Doppler effect is what he described, and he also helped Mendel become proficient at mathematics, which was also very, very rare in the natural sciences, and was one of Darwin's biggest weaknesses, that Darwin and math just They didn't go together. Doppler, uh, he he was ill and he had to retire early and he passed away early. He was replaced by, see if I can say this, Andreas von Ettingshausen. Anyway, Ettingshausen was a fan of number theory and counting theory, that everything can be put into categories and everything can be all the range of different possibilities that you can connect different uh, organisms or numbers or names or everything. And the 1850s was known as an age of numbers and counting. Everybody, they describe it as everybody was counting everything. And but it just didn't really make it into the biological sciences very much. So Mendel leaves the University of Vienna with a unique blend of training. His plants and growing plants and hybridizing plants and statistical analysis, numbers, which is very, very unique combination. And that's one of the things I think that really enabled him to see what others had missed at the time. His ability to do experiments, large sample sizes, and then to statistically analyze those somewhat. Probably while he was in Vienna, he probably ate. Not that I'm obsessed with food, but I walked by this little stand here, and they had a machine where they take a loaf of bread and they'd stick it on this post and they'd pull it back out and it would fill the inside with mustard. And then you'd have your choice of sausages or bratwurst. On here, there's 5 different kinds of sausages on this little grill. And I think it was €5 I got from one of those. And it was so good, I couldn't even believe it, how good it was. And I have since become obsessed with bratwurst. And of course, while you're in the area, might as well sample some strudel. And the apple strudel was very good. I mean, I had to eat while I was there too. I couldn't go 2 months without eating. Obviously, I didn't. The buildings and the government buildings, this is the main government building in Vienna, is just the number of these things, just from standing in this one spot, you can see like 4 of them. And it's from the, given down to us from the Habsburg, and I just like to say that, Habsburg. Like this gigantic statue. Look at, these are people sitting on it, on the pedestal here. And just everywhere you went in Vienna was just these opulent buildings. Maybe he took in an opera at the Vienna Opera House. I did. According to one of my heroes, Rick Steves, a travel guide on TV, he said, go on in there. He said, you get for €5, you get a standing room only ticket, which I did, and I actually found a seat for a little while. And he said, I don't have 3 hours of opera in me, so I'll go in there for a few minutes, and when I'm ready to leave after a half an hour, I'll leave. So he said to do that, so I did that, and I found out within a half hour that Viennese opera is not for me. But I went there. So Vienna, Mendel completes his studies at the University of Vienna, and he has to take another, he takes his retest. Remember, he had terrible test anxiety, which might have been why he did so poorly on the first exam. And so there's a committee again, same kind of thing, room, they're going to grill him. The first question he gets is from this guy, Edward Fensel, who happened to be the director of the Vienna Botanical Gardens. So it's not just some random person. And nobody really knows what happened in that meeting, except that Mendel got mad after the first question and just left. He just walked out. And the reigning theory is that Fensel was at the time what was known as a spermist. And there was 2 schools of thought: a preformation, that inside one of the gametes, sperm or egg or pollen in the plant and ova, that the embryo is fully formed in the gamete. And the spermist's idea was that inside the sperm is something called a homunculus, a little person. And that when the sperm fertilizes the egg doesn't bring anything to the equation. It just allows the development of the offspring. Now remember, we're talking about 1850 and before. This drawing is actually by the guy who invented the microscope and perfected microscopy, although he didn't leave the recipe on how to make his microscopes. I don't know how to say his name exactly. Van Leeuwenhoek, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, or Leeuwenhoek. However I say it, it's wrong. So Fensel was an avowed spermist. Mendel believed that both parents contributed to the offspring. And, today it's like, well, duh. And evidently they argued about that. And Mendel, it's thought that maybe Mendel left that and went back to Brno to do his plant experiments in order to refute Fensel's approach. And it's interesting, later on, Mendel's work went unnoticed for about 60 years, and one of the rediscoverers was Fensel's grandson. And so Mendel goes back to Brno to raise peas. And here's a quote: "I was determined to know beans." Mendel, in Walden, from Henry David Thoreau. Mendel went back to Brno because he wanted to know peas, not beans. And this is a picture of my garden that I took on Sunday afternoon. It's early in the season. I got some winter plants. I got some good spinaches going. I got a nice batch of onions, but my broccolis and cabbages and cauliflowers, it's still early. But those are my plant babies, and that's what I call them. And that's what Mendel called his peas plants. He called them his babies. See, here's one of mine right here. And of course, that would raise people's eyebrows because he was a monk. He said, "Would you like to come and see my children?" And they were like, "What?" So this is something that, these are pea plants too, something that made Mendel think that the mother must have something to do with it, is that if you take a true breeding purple plant, that means that it has no history of the other trait in its family, what we now call a dominant trait, that and cross that with a white plant. If these are the parental generation, what we call the first generation, or F1 generation after that, which means philo, family, is 100% purple. It's not light purple. There's no evidence. It's the same color purple as its, try to say this, purple plant parent. And so the white trait leaves. But when he would cross one of these first generation plants with itself, second generation would come out with 75% or 3 out of 4 purple plants, and then the white plant would show up. And the white plant would be just as white as its white flowered grandparent, with no trace of purple in it. And so that led Mendel to start thinking about that there must be something in this first generation plant that's being carried from its white parent. And so he started thinking that maybe there's some kind of particulate type of thing about inheritance. He wasn't quite on at the level of gene quite yet. That this white trait skips a generation and shows up just as white as its parent refutes the idea of the day that the gametes, the sperm or egg, met in the offspring and blended together. And that just doesn't really work, because if you have, like, the example is, if you have a pail of white paint and you put a drop of red in there and stir it, it's gone. And you're not ever going to get that red drop of paint back. So this refutes that blending theory and got Mendel to thinking. And he raised peas. So here's some pea plants. Here they flower like plants do, and then they produce their vegetables. And here's a nice picture of a plant flower. But now think about how meticulous. So we can see about how the size of these flowers, size of a $50. In order for Mendel to control the breedings of these plants, what he had to do is he had to emasculate them. So the way the plant works is there's the stamen has the pollen, that's the male gamete, and either in peas they can self-fertilize at the stigma, which leads down to the female part of the plant, or something like a bee or a hummingbird can come and transfer the pollen to the plant. And so in order for Mendel to control the breedings, first thing he had to do is he had to emasculate. He had to take the male parts off so he could control which plants he crossed with which plants. Very tedious work. He worked with a tiny pair of clippers. And then when he got done, he would put a little burlap sack over the top of the flower to stop cross-pollination from an insect. So, and he raised thousands and thousands of these. So the more I looked into his work, the more I was amazed at not only his ability to conduct these experiments, but his dedication and record keeping had to be tremendous. Another thing about pea, he's not the only one that was raising peas in Europe at the time. Peas are a good plant to study genetics for several reasons. One is that they have discrete traits. A discrete trait is one that falls into one of two categories. So, for instance, in height in plants, the plants were either tall or they were short. They were either 6 feet tall or 6 inches tall, nothing in between. And so we can plot a discrete trait on a bar graph. And you know, there had to be some math in here at some point. I'll try not to trigger you too badly. On a bar graph like this, we have the trait on the x-axis, and we have the number of individuals on the y-axis. And when he did these crosses, he found out that in his F2 generation, the second generation would be, just like with the flower color, 75% tall, 25% short. And the trait that's always shown, he called it the dominating trait, and the recessive term came into play later. And these are great to work with discrete traits is great to study genetics, and the pea plant has a bunch of them. A continuous trait can take on any value between its extremes, and we see that typically with the bell curve or the normal distribution, where if you look at height distribution in humans, there's an average height. And there's some people that are really, really tall. You find them on an NBA court. There's some people that are really, really short. You find them riding horses. They're in the audience. This is a terrible, continuous traits are terrible to study genetics because they're usually also influenced by the environment. So for instance, I'm 5'8", which is a little bit less than average height for men. I probably would have been taller if my parents had fed me when I was a child and I didn't start smoking in second grade. No, I never smoked, thankfully, and we ate well as a child. But still, it's influenced by the environment, and you don't want that when you're studying genetics. You want to just look at the genes involved. One of the traits that Mendel studied about the pea plants, one of the first things he studied was the shape of the pea. That the dominant trait was round, and the recessive trait was they would be wrinkled or angular, as they called it. And I just can't help but wonder about this one down here. Is that a Death Star? The Death Star seed. Get it while it's young. So peas have lots of discrete traits, more than just this, but the ones that Mendel studied were plant flower. Where on the plant the flowers showed up? Were they coming out of the middle of the stem, or at the terminal at the very end of the plant? Were the peas yellow or green? Were they round or wrinkled, like in that last picture? Tall, dwarf, and there was a couple of them. And Mendel was able to control the breedings by, like I mentioned, cutting off the male part of the plant and controlling which plants he fertilized with which pollen. But another thing is that this gives him large sample size. It's easy to grow peas, lots of them. And for instance, elephants are not good to study this type of genetics from, because first of all, it takes a long time to grow an elephant. Where he would get how many generations of pea plant he got each year, that's up for question. He might have gotten more than one if he grew inside, but that's not exactly known. Here's some pictures from the museum of smooth or round versus angular. The seed pods were either inflated or green or yellow in that picture. Things we don't know. We don't know exactly where the garden is. I believe the second author that the garden was in front of the greenhouse because it was just larger. The other greenhouses we typically show, like the picture I showed earlier, was just too small. Did he grow them indoors? Did he grow peas for his experiments in the greenhouse? We're not even sure about that. Did he have notebooks? Probably he had to. The record keeping, it must be astounding. Did he have somebody help him? We don't know that either. Why don't we know that? Well, later on, Mendel was elected abbot of the monastery, and the person that he defeated in that election became the abbot after Mendel passed away. Was not a big fan of Mendel and took all of his notes and notebooks and burnt them. So that part's lost. We don't even know which order he did his trials in, which plants he grew first. Here's another picture of the brothers. I love this picture. It's the only one I've ever seen of Mendel smiling. And he's got one of his little children in there. I tried, but I can't find out who this guy is. He didn't have many friends. Mendel's best friend was a local banker. Here's Abbot Knapp. And then there's this guy. I'm thinking, this is the first sergeant. This is the guy that Knapp sent. If you were in trouble, go see this guy. He'll deal with you. That just scares me. So back to that greenhouse. I think that this area in front of the greenhouse is most likely to, like I said, I agree with that one author, most likely to be where he grew most of his peas. I think he had to have help. There was one of the monks, it might have been the one that Mendel was looking at in that other picture, offered to help him. We just don't know, so I can't say with certainty. And there he is, contemplating his peas, like I contemplated so many damselfly larvae or freshwater snails during my studies. So back to the old skipping generation. So Mendel was the first one to use something similar to what we use today, where he realized that the one trait was different than the other, and he gave them letters. He gave a capital letter to the dominating trait and a lowercase letter to what we call the recessive trait. And he didn't differentiate between what a plant looked like and what its genetic makeup was, not in his papers anyway. And so the first generation over here that had to show the dominating trait, he would have represented with a capital letter. Later on, he realized that it probably had to have a little bit of both. And so that's why that's in parentheses. And that because when we cross this plant, we would get 75% that were the dominating trait and 25% of the recessive trait. But Mendel realized that in his dominant plants that there was one was pure breeding, it had both copies of his gene were the dominating trait, but that two of those three were hiding the recessive trait. And then, of course, he had the 25% as a recessive trait. Now, today, what we would call the way we would represent this would be we would call this they're both the same. That this plant would have two copies of the dominant trait, and then a dominant and a recessive for two of them, and then the double recessive. It has to be double recessive in order to show that trait, because what the dominant trait means, if it's different like this, what we call heterozygous, then the dominant trait completely masks the recessive trait. And that doesn't always happen. That's another little stroke of luck. Sometimes both genes are expressed. Sometimes there's a whole lot of exceptions to that rule. And so what we did here is in the early 1900s, a fellow by the name of Bateson, who was a big Mendelist, and after Mendel's work was rediscovered 50 years after he published it in 1865, he came up with an algebraic way to express this. So maybe you remember your algebra days, and if that term triggers you, well, then I've got some unicorns and rainbows over here to make you feel better. Concentrate on the rainbows and unicorns. And you remember we had FOIL first. And so what this indicates here, and something else that Mendel is known for, he's known for recognizing that there were two components in each organism's genetic makeup, and that they split during the formation of the sperm or egg, or pollen or egg. And so in this case, if it turns out that these are on different chromosomes, and that the chromosome containing the big A gets into a gamete, that's what it's carrying. But also this organism can make the other half of its gametes would be the little a. And the same thing when we cross hybrids with the other parent. And so we could do first, which would be big A and big A over here. Outside, big A, little a over here. Inside, little a, big A over here. And last, little a, little a. And it would give us that. But that's a little awkward, and it's tough to deal with. And so in about 1805, this fellow here who was working with Bateson, Reginald Punnett, he came up with what we now call the Punnett square, where you take the different types of gametes that can be made from one parent and put those at the column headings, the different types of gametes from the other parent, you put them at the row headings, And for instance, like this row has a big A, so we'd put capital A there. This column over here has a little a, so we'd put that in that column. And then that eliminates the need for math, which I don't mind math, but a lot of people don't. And so what this box represents is 100% of the possibilities. And so 25%, this one box here, is going to be capital A, capital A. You could express that as 25%, 1 out of 4, or 0.25, which are all the same number. Two of these boxes have the capital A, lowercase a. And so that is 50%, 4 out of 2, which simplifies to a half, or 0.5. And this lonely one in the corner down here, 25% of the little a. And then when we go to say, well, what do these plants look like, which we call what we call the phenotype today? How does this genetic orchestra play out? That 3/4 of them would be dominant, 1/4 would be recessive. And this hopefully is a little kind of simple to see when you're just going through one trait, but when you throw in another trait here and your box has 16 possibilities, what we call a dihybrid cross, this box comes in really, really handy. So let's ease our brains and walk around the Abbey for a little while and put the math aside. This is Mendel's room. Typical austere cell that he would live in. The name cell actually came from a guy named Robert Hooke, who looked at cork in a microscope. And Robert Hooke was bitter enemies with Isaac Newton. And interesting, in episode 3, I'll probably tell a little story. I managed to drive by and go to Isaac Newton's childhood home, where he did a lot of his work because they had closed Cambridge University for the Black Plague, something that we kind of went through around here a little bit of. Anyway, Hooke described what he saw in these cork shavings as the kind of cells that a monk lives in. And I told my mom that one day. I said, I don't see that. And she said to me, well, have you ever been in a monastery? I said, no, but now I have been. And as far as monasteries and the cells that monks live in, this is very nice. There was another first monastery I actually went into was San Marco in Florence, and it literally was like a cell, concrete floor, about yay big, maybe 10 by 10, 12 by 12, something like that. So Mendel's living it up pretty nicely here. This is not the exact coat he wore, but it's something similar, the frock. Each monk had a little wood burning or coal burning stove in their room, which I don't know how they didn't burn the place down repeatedly like that. And if you look out his window, that's what you see. The gate, this gate out here, leads to a square, which is today called Mendelplatz, named in his honor. Everywhere in Brno, everywhere you go, you see Mendel. Here's where he definitely grew vegetables, at least for the garden. There's the entrance to the museum and the greenhouse. One of the things that he witnessed while he was there, a tornado came through, right through the courtyard. And he describes it as mayhem and loud and crashing and burning, and ceiling tiles flew through his window and went across the room, and it made a big impression on him. As I'd mentioned earlier, he was an amateur meteorologist, and he became the official meteorologist for Brno later on, after the other one just couldn't do it anymore. And 3 times a day, Mendel would take readings on a barometer and temperature readings, and he would send them once a month. He would send them to the main meteorology office in Vienna. There's the stairs. So one of the things that I wanted to justify in my proposal was, why do I have to go here? Why can't I study Mendel and Darwin and Vesalius from the books or the internet? And this is one of the answers. Let me go up there and walk in the steps of Mendel. Had I not gone there, I wouldn't be able to go through the gate. Had I not gotten my discounted tour with a very wonderful tour guide named Teresa. So we went up these stairs, and we came up around here, down through here, and here's another locked gate. Without being there, without the tour guide, I don't get to go through that gate. And that gate led to his apiary, where he raised bees. And that's looking back toward the gate. And Mendel, like I told you, Mendel, all the pictures of him are all serious, serious. But he had a mischievous side. He was giving a friend of his a tour of his apiary early in the spring before the bees had really had a chance to come out. And he noticed his friend was wearing a color hat that the bees would like. And the bees being in their hives the whole year, winter, when they came out, they had business to take care of. You know what I mean? And so told his friend, he said, set your hat down there and see what happens. And so the bee swarmed it and pooped all over his friend's hat, and he laughed. So he wasn't always serious. And here's some of the old city walls. It's behind this tree, but there's a Spielberg castle up on this mountain that in Mendel's time was used as a prison. And I didn't get a chance to go in that castle, but it must have been dank and dark and wouldn't want to be in that dungeon. There it is. I thought I had a picture of that. And so here I am in Brno, standing in the courtyard of the monastery, looking at sites like this, and I'm thinking, this is why I came here. Just to the right of that picture, that's the view of the church, the cathedral, and here they have a little fireplace, and they would bring school kids and give them tours of the monastery, and then they'd sit around and roast marshmallows around this campfire, which just sounds like a really good time. This is the refectory where the brothers would eat. When I was there, I happened to, there was going to be a lecture there by a famous fellow from a university in, where was it? It's one of those Eastern, now it just escapes me. It'll come to me in just a second. Lithuania. And he was given a talk on molecular genetics and gene editing. And was really, so I said, well, I have to go see that. And this was, by the time I got in there, it was jam-packed. And they had an off-site where you could watch on a screen. It was standing and sitting room only. It was just jam-packed with people. It was actually quite fascinating. It was about an hour long, and I was able to hang along with the guy for about 20 minutes, and then he lost me. But it was about current biotechnology, which is it was kind of neat to be able to see something like that while I was actually at the monastery. They have a beautiful library, very ornate. And like I said, the St. Augustine promoted reading, and so the brothers would oftentimes they'd read, do lots of reading. They had this wonderful library. They wouldn't read the books in the library though. What they did was, see this that little crease right there? Secret passageway. And on the other side of that wall is another set of rooms. And there's the basement down there where the brothers would go to do their reading. And I asked my guide, I said, have you ever been down there? And she said, no. And I said, let's go. No, nobody will know. There's nobody here. And she was like, she looked at me like, this is just another one of these Eastern European, just really like, that's not even a question. How could you even bring that up? And I was like, me? You know, that's the first place that I wanted to go back there and sneak in there. I wasn't able to, though. So I don't know what's down there. I plan on finding out someday. Here's a copy of his paper he published in 1865. And it's published in the Proceedings of the Brno Society of Natural Sciences, which is a fairly obscure outfit. He went in and he gave a talk for about an hour, and he said that the audience was sort of glassy-eyed and nobody asked any questions. And the author I read suggested that it's probably because nobody was ready to understand what he was saying. And he came back the next month and gave a second presentation and got the same results. No questions, no fanfare, and it went relatively unnoticed, like I said, for about 50 years. Here's a picture of Mendel. There's Mendel's pictures everywhere. This is in his museum there. This is outside the cathedral. There, you know there had to be one. A selfie with the statue. I'll tell you a little bit more about that statue in just a second. But this was what some of my traveling get up, and I'll tell you more about this in episode 3. I had this jacket. I had a University of Bologna sweatshirt hoodie, and a turtleneck shirt, and I had regular T-shirts. But this was my cold weather get up right here, and I had a backpack suitcase, and I had a little kind of like backpack that you'd carry like a school kid would, and I could very easily change in and out of the layers here. So, like I said, later on, Mendel got elected abbot of the monastery, and that pretty much ended his scientific pursuits. He did some other work that didn't really turn out well, um, and also he was very, very busy. Being abbot of the monastery in St. Thomas Monastery in Brno is a very prestigious position. And for instance, you were going to be on what we would call the Chamber of Commerce. You were going to be on the board of the local bank. You would be expected to host social gatherings. It's an upper echelon type of society position, and he didn't really have. He lamented that he didn't have time to study his plant babies after that. I can't remember exactly in the monastery where I saw this, but this is his shield, his abbatial shield. Each abbot had a shield, and they called it abbatial. Took me a little while to figure out what that word meant the first time I heard it. And like most of these shields, and I'm working on one for me, but Mendel had lily. That was his favorite plant, and he had that because it was his favorite. In this other panel, he had a plow to show his humble upbringings as a farm boy, and the cross to represent his position as a monk, and charity, which is one of their tenets. Here represents friendship, and the alpha and the omega represent science. Then his final resting place. The central cemetery in Brno is just a short train ride from the monastery. The first day I went there, it was dark and gloomy and rainy, and this part of the cemetery was closed because they had had a storm that knocked down a bunch of trees, and the city was cleaning it up, and so they had it closed. And I was like, oh no, I had to turn around and leave. It's a really big, beautiful cemetery. The next day I came back, it was much nicer weather, and this is the St. Thomas Abbey section of the cemetery. It was really nice, and I sat over here for a while and contemplated everything I had learned, and I probably sat there for an hour and went through my phone and looked at the pictures to remind myself of the places I'd been studying Mendel. I had not yet been to Vienna. I went there the next day, but that's where I contemplated his existence. And so, just like I said, I would do in my proposal, there I am. There it is over his plot. They were actually they took the headstone away, and they're refurbishing that area. There's his statue. In 1910, Itzel, the first author of the first book, decided he wanted to have a statue built to commemorate Mendel. And so he started taking up a collection and circulating a petition to get the money to build it. And that's a story that's a little bit beyond our scope, but it's a really intriguing story because the rediscoverers of Mendel's work were not all big fans of Mendel. One of them, Hugo de Vries, thought he was onto something. And he was all excited that he had discovered these laws of inheritance. And he was looking to be, we were going to call this de Vriesian genetics instead of Mendelian genetics. So he was mad, and he refused to sign the petition, and he refused to come to the ceremony that unveiled the statue. And he said, well, these kind of things are it's a fad. It'll go away. And he was such a Debbie Downer on that one. Sorry if your name's Debbie. The statue was originally in what became known as the Mendelplatz, that little square outside the monastery. And in the 1950s, the Soviet Union, the government of the Soviet Union, was trying to erase Mendelian genetics, and so the members of the Czechoslovakian army moved the statue to the current location to protect it. And later on, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Czech government asked the brothers, "You want us to put it back out in the square?" And they said, "No, leave it right where it is. It seems to be it's in the right place." This is not the original pedestal. That got destroyed, and this drove Bateson, one of his followers, crazy. Is that the pea plants are growing up this stone when they would never grow up on stone? You'd have to put something like a chain link fence or chicken wire or something to get the peas to grow up it. That drove Bateson crazy. So like I said, then I went to Vienna, just like Mendel did. This is a nice marketplace. This marketplace goes on like this for about a half a mile. It was fun to just walk around, and I went to very few restaurants. First of all, I was on a tight budget. I tried to eat for as less money as I possibly could. As I said, I was over there for 60 days, and if I could save $10 a day, that's $600. If I could, how easy would it be to go to a restaurant and order something and have it be over there, 25, 30 euros, when I could eat for much less? I'm one of the things I'm proud of is the money that I didn't spend on, and it turns out that the street food everywhere, almost everywhere, is the best way anyway. Told you went to the opera. There's proof. That's not Photoshop, and I didn't get it off the internet, and I wasn't supposed to take pictures. This is a monument to Saint Teresa, the mother of one of the Habsburg emperors. I'm not even going to say the name. I forgot which one it was. But this is in another place. This isn't the first statue I showed you. They're everywhere. The buildings on the left and right of this picture are just so opulent, it's just unbelievable. I didn't know that my little furry friend had a side gig in Vienna. It turns out that my buddy Barky here is running a franchise selling bratwurst called Bad Dog. He claims his innocence. All right, and he hasn't filed his taxes yet either. All he does is tax me. At our house, we have a cheese tax. You get out the cheese, the dogs are looking at you. They're like, come on, it's April 15th every day. This is the other side of the brewery in the Mendelplatz. And here's the tram station. And here's all this says Mendel Plaza, I guess. No really wandering around lost when it came to the language there. I walked past this twice before somebody told me what it was. It's a sculpture that's supposed to represent peas, round versus angular. This is the entrance to St. Thomas. There's the main building. The greenhouse would be over here. And the cathedral over here. Told you they had a birthday party. Need to get the Czech experience. So I came back later to see what was going on. And there was no invitations, no tickets, so I crashed the party. Wearing my hoodie. And it was actually kind of a nice party. We had a nice spread. And some of that pork that they had roasted all day long. I'm telling you what, the Eastern Europeans can cook some pork if that's your thing. And there's the modern day abbot right there. I didn't introduce myself. Wouldn't know what to say. I couldn't even say hello in Czech. I'd call it up on my Google Translate and it would say something that I could not repeat. I don't know, is what it sounded like to me. After I left Vienna, like I said, I took the train. This is a courtyard at the hotel I stayed at in Salzburg. Salzburg is where they film most of the Sound of Music. It's one of the places I would give a double thumbs up. Go there if you're anywhere near that area. It's such a beautiful, small town. And I would sit in this courtyard during the day sometimes, and at night I only spent 3 nights in Salzburg, but I would get out my laptop and I would make PowerPoints and take notes. I kept a diary, a log each day, and so I would sit out here with some non-alcoholic beer, some non-alcoholic wine, and did some work. It was work. Really was working at a place and I did this in lots of nice little places. And one of the things that surprised me was I had a hard time finding a place to work in a lot of places, busy cafes. One time I got kicked out of the National Gallery in London because I was in the cafeteria there, and I was sitting in there working for about an hour and a half, and the guy came up to me and said, "Did you order anything?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, it's crowded. We kind of need a seat, if you don't mind." I was like, "Okay." Well, I got kicked out of the National Gallery of London for working on my laptop, so it's a nice story anyway. And Bradley, you can appreciate this too. A visitor to a garden sees the successes, usually. The gardener remembers the mistakes and losses, some for a long time, and imagines the garden in a year and in the unimaginable future. From A Shape of Water, and that S should be capitalized, by W.S. Merwin. And I took this picture on Sunday. This is my yard. And our yard goes all the way to that White House. So far, you can just barely even see our 50-foot tall windmill right here. Our property line when we originally bought that house goes right about here. And no, right about here. And when my neighbor unfortunately passed away, rest in peace, Marshall, I was able to buy this property at a very reasonable price. And it was kind of overgrown, and there was a lot of junk in it. And that was 2019. It took me a while to clean it up, and I have since planted 170 trees out there. And when I say I planted 170 trees, that's not the landscape company pulling up in their truck with a trailer. That's me with a shovel. And I've had to replace, there's some losses. Some trees, like last June, remember how wet it was last June? All the new trees that I had planted last spring and winter, the spring and winter of 23, 24, we have real clay soils there. And so the new plant balls just acted as a bowl and they just drowned. And so I had to replace them. So far this year, I planted 17 trees to replace them of different varieties of ornamentals, fruit trees. I've got a little plum grove in one section, peaches in another, nectarines in another section. I've got a lot of live oak trees. Those are one of my favorite trees, many of which I grew from acorns. And each of the live oak trees has a name. This one right here is Raphael. It's either a Renaissance artist, a historical figure, a family member. Very few of them don't fit that bill. This one over here is Caravaggio. Over here, I have trees named Pam, Becky. There's even one named me. I know that sounds narcissistic, and maybe, but it didn't seem right to have my two sisters and not me there. And I call that area of the yard our generation. Right about, it's really small because I just put it in this year, maybe right about here is a tree called the Weltners, which is my niece and her husband. And they're scattered all over. Over here is one for my dad. My mom is back off that direction somewhere. Around this corner, right back here, is a tree whose name is Hung Vu. And there's 4 trees out there that do not fit the description of historical figure, family member, or artist. And those are my 3 best friends and Hung Vu. And the reason is Hung Vu has done so much for me and my family. I can never repay him or thank him enough. During the COVID lockdowns, he made sure that I had the teaching load that I needed and wanted, and my family didn't suffer 1 penny loss, which is something not everybody can say. Dr. Vu treats me fairly. He treats all of us in the life science department fairly. We get along real well as a team because he's the captain. And he had to back out of a search committee meeting the Friday before spring break. We're hiring a new director for our science center. And he put out an email and asked people to volunteer. Now, a lot of department chairs, they could walk up to you and say, guess what? I need you to do this. I know it's the Friday of spring break, but guess what, Burnside? We need you to come in. And I asked him on Wednesday before spring break, did anybody volunteer? And he said, no. And I said, all right, I got you back. I'll do it. And I'm glad I did, actually. I just wished it wasn't that day. But I'd tell you what, I could do Hung Vu a dozen favors and I'd still owe him. So I'll do anything for him. So what does that have to do with this quote? I'm building a forest here. It started out as an overgrown field. I planted all these trees. I can imagine this in the what it's going to be like after I'm gone. And Mendel and Darwin both had visions of bigger things in the future and bigger picture items. And so with that, I've got a couple of acknowledgments. I want to thank Dr. Coates, Jerry Coates, former Dean of Fine Arts, retired. He started the faculty study abroad program in 2017, where he took 10 of us to London for 10 days. And if Dr. Coates hadn't done that, I don't know if I'd ever would have traveled internationally. I always wanted to, but I never actually pictured myself going there. Dr. Coates took me there in 2017, amongst other people. 2018, he took us to Spain for 10 days, which I never would have thought I'd fall in love with Spain, but I did. In 2019, he took a group to Northern England and Scotland. I didn't go on that one because it was time to take my wife to Italy. My wife had watched me go to London. She had watched me go to Spain. She watched from here. And she had always wanted to go to Italy. That was the only place she'd ever wanted to go, was Rome and Florence. And so when I got back from these places. I said, we'll go eventually. I said, Penny's life matters. And she's like, yeah, sure it does. Anyway, so I couldn't go a third time with them. So my wife and I went there. But hats off, thank you to Dr. Coates, who's an absolutely wonderful person. I want to thank Dr. Autry. He's the first one who signed off on my FDL application. He could have just said, no, you know what, Burnside, this is a bad idea. He signed it off and he sent it to Dr. Jackson, who's now the Vice President of Academic Affairs for Connect, but was a longtime VPAA on our campus. Both of those people provided me valuable insight that I was and allowed me to change my proposal a little bit. Dr. Coppola, who retired last year, he also signed off on it, and he I hope he's going to eventually watch this. He was very much a proponent of this. Then after all that, it goes to the FDL committee, and a group of faculty sit around and score your application, and they either recommend thumbs up or thumbs down. They gave me the thumbs up and sent it off to the chancellor, who signed off on it, and the rest is history. And I have since, when I came back last fall, and they were looking for volunteers for this year's FDL committee, and I thought, I should probably volunteer for that. So I'm doing a 2-year stint on that committee. And I'm getting a look. I looked at it from the other side this year. Acknowledgements Part 2. Brandon Stephen, who did a lot of logistics associated with planning and getting the room. And by the way, if you're here for professional development, there's QR codes on the tables that you can scan so you can get your credit. Thanks to Brandon for that. He's the VPAA's assistant. And these two gentlemen right here, Danny Che and Wade Brandt, are proof that not all heroes wear capes. My ability to not figure out technology is unprecedented. And these two have bailed me out so many times that I literally, when I see them, I feel calm and comfortable because I know everything is going to be okay. So thank you for everything you've done for me, everything today, and everything I'm sure we're going to have to do in the future. This is going to be hard to talk through this one. My dear sweet wife, Penny. Whether I'm winning a hockey championship, this is one of my favorite pictures of us, fly fishing on the Guadalupe, or at the Vatican looking at a Leonardo. She's been by my side for over 20 years. Look at that smile. It's always nice to see that. I'm not going to lie, there were some dark times when I was setting up this project. It was not only, and I'm thankful to the district for paying my salary and my benefits while I was gone. They had to hire a replacement for me to go. That was expensive. Cost the district a lot of money. But I wasn't going to get overload. And an overload is a really important part of our income, a really important part. So I was going to be making a lot less money. Or as I called it, I said it's going to be 6 months of Februaries. Because in February, we don't get our overload check. And she said, it'll be all right. It'll be all right. Just do what Jerry said, Dr. Coates. He said, just put it on a credit card. You won't regret it. She kept saying that, knowing that I was going to be over there for 6 months, 60 days, 2 months without her. She kept saying, go. And I kept saying, no. There was 100 times I said, no, I'm going to cancel. I'm not going to go. And I wasn't really committed until finally they hired my replacement. Anyway, she never wavered in her support of this project. I wavered a lot. And because now we've got to pay that off. When I first was approved, I ran out and bought a plane ticket. Cheap plane ticket. Like $650 round trip to Heathrow. But I couldn't change anything. And I realized while I was over there that I didn't need 2 months. I wasn't going to need a whole 2 months. So I told her, I said, why don't you come over there for 10 days or 2 weeks? And you saw the map. I said, pick a spot. I'll meet, we can go do something. And she said, no. You know what she said? Here's a Stepmother of the Year award. Stepmother of the Year? Stepmother of the Century. She said, take your daughter, her stepdaughter, my oldest daughter, Shelby. She said, Shelby wants to go and study the Holocaust over there. Take her instead. Who says that? No, I don't know. I'm going to go to Europe for 2 weeks. Take your daughter instead. So that's absolutely amazing. And then finally, one more quote, last slide. Then the day came when the risk to remain tight in the bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. by Anus Nin. This is a picture this is a picture of the day I graduated from the PhD program. That's the first day I wore the robe. It's my mom over here, of course. Sorry, probably not her favorite picture. This is my dad. And I was looking at this picture. My aunt dug this up just a couple weeks ago. I'm within 6 months of the same age as my dad was in this picture. And this is my oldest daughter, Shelby, 31 years old now with 2 grandkids. And this is my youngest daughter, Kayla, who's 2 weeks old, who's going to turn 27 in May, if you can believe that. And so here are 2 of my patrons. And I'd like to think that on this particular day, I was able to make good on their hope. From when I came back from Chicago as a Domino's pizza guy, I went back to school. And so thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Albert. May you rest in peace. And that's about all the time I've got. Are there any questions pop up anywhere? Or is this like Mendel's presentation? Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Bradley. I have to come over again. Oh.
And I got some advice on placemaking and sites of historical consciousness that I think will help show the value of that type of thing a lot more. I guess my biggest, I'll mention now in case anybody is what extent do you think, like, so Lori and I had a student replicate this. To what extent was that something you think we could do in a greenhouse? Because I got pretty good at myself that I think would probably be dominant. That's a little bit. How likely do you think we could replicate on small?
I think that it could be done. You'd need a sizable greenhouse and also some vision yourself, because of the nature of student workers is like a student club. They come and go. You have them, maybe for a year or so. So you would have to have some oversight, faculty oversight to cover all that. The actual breeding part would be a big challenge, but it could be done. I mean, Mendel did it back in the 1850s. It would be a great ongoing project to have on campus. In the greenhouse, you could probably get 3 generations a year. So it'd be doable. That'd be interesting. Here, I'll even donate you a pea plant to get started. Anybody else? Yes, Emily.
I won't lie, I didn't have a full understanding, so I was kind of cynical in the sense of like, there's no way he could have gotten those results. Like some of those must have been something like I didn't know.
That's one of the criticisms of that people say he couldn't have grown that many pea plants in that garden that was by the building. That's why they're saying. That's why I believe that one author who suggested that the garden would be that bigger area in front of the greenhouse. But yeah, the more I looked into it, especially the hybridization part of it, it was way after all this stuff that I was talking about. But later on, while he was abbot, he was working on what's called Hyraceum. I don't know the common name of it, but a very famous plant breeder from the University of Munich, would send Mendel these plants for him to hybridize it. He had to actually do that same kind of thing, only under a microscope, because the flowers were very, very small. And Mendel was the best plant breeder of his day. Yes. Yeah, and if you want any of the pictures, or let me. Yeah, whichever one you want. I'd be happy to provide that for you. And that's one of the things, obviously talking about Mendelian genetics in our general biology classes is a thing. The thing is going to be to not talk about it for 2 class periods. Because obviously, once I get going, um, it's hard to stop. But I think also one of the things I've realized is that by looking into the lives of these scientists, whether it be Mendel, Darwin, Vesalius, Golgi, um, by studying their lives, you're actually kind of studying the scientific process, scientific method by itself, uh, because then you learn about how it is they developed their ideas and how they actually implemented them. And so the scientific method, you could say, well, it starts out with an observation, and then you develop a hypothesis, and you have a control and an experimental that differ in the variable, and then the next thing to make it a little bit more exciting. The scientific method is not always just like that. So yeah, you want to use any of those pictures, just let me know. You want me to come to your class and give a 15-minute spiel? So a week from Tuesday, I'm going to Northwest campus to talk to their biology club. Yes. Not really. And that the only recognition he really got while he was alive was as a meteorologist. He just died from kidney failure and edema that led to, like congestive lung failure. That they didn't really do cause of death well back then, but he had bad kidneys, they said. Yeah. So I don't know. Am I still recording? Yeah. So can you hear me? So the question is about Mendel's rediscovery, how that happened. There were actually 3. De Vries was one of them, all about the same time, when it's this thing in science, when there's the paradigm shift idea, when there's they weren't ready for Mendel back in the 1860s. And his journal article was in that Proceedings of the National Society of Brno were quite obscure. And so the number of times it was cited was very few until the 1900s. And then when De Vries, for instance, was working up his ordeal, what happened was, I don't know how the good stories start with. What happened was, Bateson was going from London to Cambridge, and he had got a copy of Mendel's paper, and he was going there to give a presentation about De Vries's work, and he realized on this train ride, wait a minute, everything just changed. This has already been discovered, which is a big thing in science. That you did something first and you give proper attribution to the people that came before you. And so it was Bateson that sort of kind of said, I hate to tell you this, guys, but and like I said, De Vries was not happy about that at all. The way I saw it described was, it's like if you go out to plow your field and you find out that one of the rows has already been plowed. It's already been done. And so, yeah, and that all happened right about in 1900 is when that happened. Anybody else? And I too am impressed with the amount of work he must have done. All right, folks. Well, thank you for coming and listening to my stories. Hopefully you'll be around for episode 3 and 4.